Hi everyone. So in this video, I'm going to look at the elementary aspects of weighing and BP debating, discussing how you weigh, why obviously weighing is important, and some description of how you can respond to weighing with other forms of weighing. Basically, we're just going to describe how you can explain why one argument is more important than another argument in many, many different ways. Right, so there are a few things we're going to talk about in the video. The first is I'm going to describe 7 different ways in which you could weigh arguments. Specifically, I'm going to give you ways in which you can advance why that should be the way in which judges weigh arguments. Then I'm going to explain some reasons or reasoning you could give to counter weighing. And then we're just going to go through some examples of how you can actually do this with the idea of strategy involved. So this is broadly what we're going to talk about. I'll start quite simple by just explaining what weighing is, and then we'll become a bit more complicated. So if you are new to debating, you might find the first part of this video more useful than the latter parts, but I do think weighing is a skill that once you get a degree of familiarity and confidence with, is one that often will be very crucial in all aspects of debating for you to do well. And I also just think it's quite an interesting and more intricate way of thinking about argument development. So it can have instrumental benefits beyond this activity, as in being able to train yourself how to think about exactly why different arguments should or shouldn't be more persuasive than others, is the layer of skill that I think uniquely BP can give to you as a thinker, as whoever you happen to be, a scientist or whatever. So cool. So let's talk about some weighing then. So what exactly is weighing, starting at the most basic level? So weighing is just a buzzword that describes a type of analysis in debating. So hopefully you're familiar with the idea of analysis, i.e. just logical justifications for why a claim is true. So you have core analysis within arguments, as in if you're trying to prove why something happens in the debate, as in if it's this house would ban drugs, and you're opening government, you're trying to convince the panel that the reason you should ban drugs is drugs are harmful, you have some analysis to why drugs are harmful, and why banning them would prevent the drugs from being distributed. So that's core pieces of analysis. The extra layer of analysis that is usually required from speakers to do well, and if you do it, you will do well, is an explanation in a more meta sense, i.e. okay, even if you are able to prove that by banning drugs you reduce the influence of harmful drugs because maybe they don't get into people's hands, why is that the most important thing in the debate? I.e., why is that more important than any argument that could be proven on opposition bench about crime reduction or crime enfranchisement, etc., or any argument closing government may argue about why there are other things that are important in the debate and then try to prove that something else changes in the debate. So weighing is a way in which you explain why the thing you think is true is important in the debate. So this is key to securing a victory, because the point of debating is not necessarily you just give a really good, robust, proven speech, you sit down and you take the first. The game is a game because it's about 4 teams rather, 8 people, trying to do the same thing you are and trying to undermine the validity of your argumentation in very many different ways, other than just, is it true? Is it important? So weighing here is a way in which you make arguments insulated against alternative proven claims, both by your opposition as well as your closing. And it is generally just a way of explaining why an argument or the outcome of an argument are debate winning, as in judges should give you the first, irrespective of the stuff that's happened in the debate, because you have justified why the thing you have proven is the thing that the judges are waiting to be proven, if that makes sense. Cool. What isn't weighing? So you might, if you've had some experience with debating, being aware of the start of weighing, which often does happen, as in people learn that weighing means things like scale, as in we affect more people and then they sit down, or we affect a more vulnerable actor and then they sit down. This isn't weighing. This is the equivalent of just making a claim in a debate but not justifying that claim. So just as you wouldn't expect to win a round if you stood up in this house would ban drugs and go, by banning drugs, we will reduce the distribution of drugs, which is important because drugs are bad for people, and then sat down. That is equivalent to the logical rigidity of saying, this impact is important because it affects loads of people, and then sitting down. Both of those things have not been proven, and therefore you haven't accessed either your argument or the weighing of that argument. So what is very crucial, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, is that weighing is not just using these buzzwords. It's an explanation for why that weighing metric, why scale does actually matter, and more importantly, why scale matters more than any other metric and any other weighing metric, i.e. vulnerability, etc. So weighing is just explaining why one argument or one system of arguments matters more than other systems of arguments, and it utilizes a different form, a meta form of analysis, by justifying why the metrics that you're winning on operate in a way that should determine the debate. So let's look at this a bit more in depth. So there are two ways to consider weighing, as in two types of ways you can explain why something is important. The first way is by impact. So what I mean by impact is just the end result, the way you impact the world, the consequence of your argumentation. In the examples that in the running theme example, it would just be drugs being bad and harmful, and your impact is reducing how many drugs get out there by banning them. So there are multiple ways you can conceptualize when trying to explain why this argument, and therefore the impact of the argument, is really important, specifically more important than other impacts in the round. The first is obviously, as we've touched on, scale. What I mean by scale is just, you could argue that because one impact affects more people than other types of impact, you should prioritize as judges, or you're explaining as a speaker, the judges should prioritize the impact that affects the most number of people, rather than those that affect few numbers of individuals. Recognize this reveals the nuance of weighing. Weighing is not only I affect some people, is essentially just not saying other arguments aren't proven in the round. Weighing is by explaining, even if all arguments have been proven in the round, this argument matters more than other arguments that could be proven. So scale is just quite intuitively trying to argue that bigger is better. We'll look at later how you actually justify this, but let's just go through the introductions of the different types of weighing metric here. The second is an idea of intensity. So another way of conceptualizing why an impact could be important is not just it affects loads of people, but the people that it does affect are affected more intensely as a result. I.e., you can imagine this as a weighing metric you would employ if you are intuitively or willing to grant that two arguments affect the same type of person, but maybe different impacts affect the person differently. You can choose to weigh by saying, even if both of the ways that these people are affected is true, as in the effects of crime for opposition bench about not banning drugs, versus the impact of the bad aspects of drug on government side, you could argue that the main stakeholder in the debate is universally affected by something by either side of the motion, but they're affected uniquely worse by the influence of drug than they are the influence of crime, i.e. because of things like proximity or the amount of harm it causes them. So this is an idea of scale of consequence, i.e. not just how many people are affected, but how much is one person affected. So this is the second way in which you could theoretically argue that one impact matters more than another. Another idea, and this is a very common buzzword one, is vulnerability. So unlike the idea of scale, you could argue that actually what is important for an impact or a consequence in a debate is not how many people are affected, but the type of person that is affected. You could say there are some types of individuals who either should principally be valued higher than others, i.e. maybe minority individuals should be prioritized in comparison to majorities for an impact, as opposed to just the scale of the majority. You can think intuitively why this might be true, as we'll justify later, to why vulnerability should be a metric, but here's just an explanation of what it is. So this is just essentially what I call penetrance in impact, as in some impacts may affect people more than others, but some impacts may get to a person more or affect certain types of actors greater than others, and thus it's not just the intensity of impact, i.e. how much it is affecting the same type of actor, but the fact that certain consequential impacts affect only some types of actors, and that those types of actors are those that we should care most about in the debate. Another way, and the final way of conceptualizing a piece of impact weighing, is longevity. So rather than affecting more people, or rather than affecting a person but very much, or rather than affecting a type of vulnerable person, it might just affect some people longer than others. So you can imagine in a debate where you have the same actor once again having the same effect, like having different effects on both sides of the house, as in government side proves actor A feels bad for X reason, but actor Y, but opposition bench proved that the same actor also feels bad on opposition bench, you could try to argue that the way in which the actor is affected on your side of the debate is one that is persistent in its effects. So the effect is happens for longer, therefore accrues greater harm, or because it happens longer, it may be, therefore you should consider it as a worse infringement upon the agency if you want to argue a principal justification here. So longevity is just the persistence of impact. So those are the 4 different ways you can conceptualize impact weighing, i.e. the impact affects more people, or the impact affects the same type of people but worse, or the impact affects a uniquely vulnerable type of individual that we should care most about in the debate, or the impact we're talking about affects the same actor but just for longer periods of time. You can see quite intuitively why these are weighings, as in why these are explanations for why one thing should matter more than another. You're just trying, and this is obviously all consequential weighing here, right? The idea of consequential weighing is to value the merits of an action or an argument based on the effects it has on people. So similarly, you could argue an impact could be positive, and therefore, you can work it positively and negatively, but it's just about quantification of impact. So there's 4 different ways to quantify an impact. And all impact weighing is to explain why the quantities of impact on your side are greater than the quantities of impact on the other side. Obviously, these 4 are also conceptually can work in a principle ground, as in you could think about principal justifications of why scale matters, intensity matters, vulnerability matters, or longevity matters, and use the same type of metric, or maybe not on a consequential sense, but maybe on a deontological sense. Feel free to look at Alistair's principle video if you want to dive deeper into the differences between how you can use deontology, i.e. the idea that there are certain look at the video on principles. Let's not get bogged down on that right now. Cool. So those are the systems of impact, weighing systems for impact. So as well as explaining why an impact should matter more than another impact, you can also explain why a piece of analysis matters more than another piece of analysis. So debating is not just a game about impacts, as in proving, not just a game about proving a consequence happens, but it's also a game about analytical rigidity. So you might have heard the idea of analytical extensions, the notion that teams can, like if a closing team can explain an argument that their opening made just in a better way. The answer here is the weighing systems of what better means. So I'm going to show you 3 examples of the ways in which you can claim that an argument, as in the core logic that underpins the validity or importance of an argument, should be valued as more persuasive. And there are 3 ways you can claim it's more persuasive. The first is the idea of certainty. So you can conceptualize that argumentation that has fewer holes and therefore is more likely to accrue should be valued by a rational judge, as judges ought to be, as something that is inherently more persuasive. So you can say here that the analysis you're providing is more certain than the analysis affected by other teams. Thus, even if impacts exist, you should weigh the debate on certainty of how you get to those impacts. We'll explain and elucidate a bit more later about how you precisely do that. I'm just using a surface level in order to illustrate what I mean here. Another way you can try to weigh pieces of argumentation as in analytical contributions to the proof of an argument is by priority. So you might argue that, okay, there may be teams that have proven the one condition that results in your impact, but there are prior conditions of analysis that lead to that impact. The example being, someone in a debate could argue that banning drugs is good because drugs be bad, and the badness of drugs matters more than anything in the debate. You could, as a closing team, just come in and prove efficacy of banning, as in the opening government impact as I framed it only resolves upon analysis about why drugs are bad, which could be very well proven, but it is delinked from the motion in the sense it has yet to have an explanation on your side of the debate to why banning drugs will actually create the conditions that lead to opening government's impact. So here you could try to prove why the policy would be effective in reducing the number or intensity or whatever, the number of bad drugs that get in people's hands, and weigh this on priority, as in you opening government would need your analysis and closing government to access their impacts, so you can steal and nab their impacts and everything they run from it, but they can't get as far as you can with them. So this is the idea of preconditions, as in what is necessary to first believe the outcome that another team has. The last way you can weigh analysis is by robustness, or the argument that whilst one team may have proven the route to get to an impact, it is more vulnerable to a response, as in it seems less, either it just seems less intuitive or seems less true, or it has actually been destroyed by the rebuttal of another team. But you, on the other hand, can provide reasons that either directly challenge the responses they've already given or sidestep the responses, making it a more persuasive analytical contribution, as in a more persuasive argument, because the judge is not left now thinking that there are reasons why the argument will be more false than other arguments. So here it's a way of weighing why you actually end up being more persuasive, because you actually deal with the responses that come, as in you're providing either incentive reasons, etc., to why it should be more true. An example here would be, returning to the motion again, this House would ban drugs. If on the efficacy burden, opening government had said banning drugs would be efficacious because drug dealers, knowing that the law has changed, will be too scared to give drugs to people now because they don't want to go to jail. This, in abstract, starts to prove the burden to why there would be a change in the debate, but it isn't very robust to challenge, right? You can obviously see it doesn't sound intuitive, but it's likely teams have ripped this apart, i.e. giving incentive reasons to why drug dealers probably don't care that much about the law, or even if they do, feel more confident and they can skirt the law, or actually this selects for the worst type of actors, as an opening government analysis would be correct for a certain type of drug dealer, but there are other types of drug dealers who wouldn't give a shit about the law, and that those would be the ones that would be left in the vacuum after the House banned drugs, ergo these people would be worse. And therefore the opening government doesn't accrue their impact. You could, in closing government, argue a more robust reason to why the ban would be effective, as in you agree with opening opposition that the incentive structures of the distributors of drugs are bad, but you just argue why the state has the efficacy to take these people out, as in why targeting or surveillance or in-group people, or why the intercompetition, basically just another reason to why police enforcement would actually be effective. Why cutting off distribution lines into a country would be more effective, etc. Why financial deterrence would massively limit the number of distribution centers that could exist, etc., etc. And why you could use political mechanisms such as arresting lower down individuals to extract concessions to know who the drug dealers are, etc. You can think about, hopefully I'm illustrating that you can think of therefore different types of literally different analytical steps to get to the same impact, and weigh it as more persuasive because it's not as vulnerable to responses or actually has as many responses against it. So those are the three ways you can weigh analysis, either on certainty, as in these things are probably likely to be more true and therefore get to the impact more likely. Priority, as in we prove every single step to get to the analysis, not just the end step. Or robustness, the analysis is more immune to challenges and thus should be credited higher in the debate. So those are ways you can weigh analysis, and then ways you can weigh impact. So let's talk about how to actually implement these weighing metrics. So I've touched on this briefly, but what this slide is going to going to explain or demonstrate is how actually in a debate to argue this convincingly to a judge, why one metric should value more than another. So weighing obviously is just satisfying the following question: why ought scale, vulnerability, intensity, longevity, why ought this weighing be the weighing in the round? As a general structure, you can either argue that X is the only thing that is available in the debate. So one logical way of making one weighing metric more important than other weighing metrics is to argue that the other weighing metrics don't have a delta in the debate. As in the case if you're trying to weigh intensity, you could say the same number of actors are affected. These actors are equally as vulnerable, and they're affected for as long as each other. So the only thing we can choose to weigh the debate on, as in the only way we can justify why one version of an argument is better than another version of an impact, is by the idea of intensity of the impact, as in explaining why the same actor feels the impact worse on our side rather than the version of the impact that exists on opposition bench. This works if judges believe, obviously, the analysis you're providing. So you don't want to just claim that other metrics are untrue. you would have to justify why scale in this case is actually symmetric in the round, why teams have actually agreed the number of people affected are the same or the types of effects are the same. Here, do not underestimate signposting in itself, as in many judges often have a everybody has a limited attention, but especially some judges who may have had a long day. You're talking at 3,000 miles an hour, and you've had an hour's worth of debate, and if you're an opposition whip and you're trying to implement this strategy, running through by just saying scale is symmetric, longevity is symmetric, vulnerability is symmetric, they might be like, I don't know if this is true, I don't think this is true because I've mistracked the debate, or I just have a different conception of the debate. This is where it's important to just flag and talk to the judges as if they're humans, to explain why that might be true, or indeed is true. Another way, and probably the way that you'll find often happening most, because number one is only usually successful if every team is vying for the same actor, and every team has agreed that what the qualities of that actor are. Oftentimes in debates, different teams will argue that the different actors are affected, that they're affected by different means, and won't agree that what the characterization of that actor is. As in, even if they agree that we're affecting women, in a feminist motion example, they may characterize some types of women as more important than others, which means you don't necessarily access scale, unless you're just being assertive that the groups of people are the same. This sometimes can be often very unpersuasive, as in it's nothing more than a claim to claim that a type of woman is the same in number as another type of woman. It's very hard to justify that or to have that sound intuitive here. So oftentimes you rely on the second way of implementing this, which is to claim that the weighing metric you're choosing, either scale, vulnerability, intensity, or longevity, is the only one that ought to win a debate. So this is the type of meta weighing, right? In these circumstances, every team will have tried to, especially if in a strong room, will have justified why, or will start to have justified why scale matters, why intensity matters, why vulnerability matters, or whatever metric they're choosing to weigh on. The point of weighing here, especially if you're a closing team, is not to then just produce another type of weighing metric, as to say, aha, opening opposition, you're incorrect, vulnerability doesn't matter, scale matters, QED. It is to prove why intensity doesn't matter to all, and why scale actually does matter, as opposed to other types of weighing metrics. So let's look at the latter consideration before we look at the former, as in, how do you convince the panel that one weighing metric actually does matter, and then we'll explain how we undermine why other types of weighing metrics don't matter. So scale. How do you think we would demonstrate that scale is actually something that should be important? Feel free to pause the video and think about this rather than just listening to me talk. It might be more instrumentally useful, as in it will, I don't need to dunk you with neuroscience, but it would actually be better for your learning. So the way in which you justify this is to explain that the reason an impact should matter in the debate, specifically if it weighs on the number of people affected, is that every individual, regardless of their minority status or regardless of their circumstances in life, are all agents that are equally as valuable or equally as affected to the same, at least almost the same in the debate. You can use rebuttal to muddy the waters about what same actually means, as in by claiming that even if a team has proved there is maybe a more intense effect, you can try to marginalize that by saying it's unclear how much like one more stressful event actually contributes to your negative state of existence. Oftentimes individuals are people that are obviously not in a hive mind. They are conditioned and reinforced to their own systems and their own circumstances, i.e. the suffering for one person, whilst it might objectively appear worse than another person's suffering, because one person is isolated from the actual experiences of others, like they can't experience the qualia of everybody else, they're only locked into their own qualia. Individuals will have a spectrum of experience that are all baseline modified to the same, as in the suffering of one person, even if it's like starvation, is all conceived relative to their status in life. As in, starvation for one person may feel just as bad as a privileged individual having their phone break, because the degree of consequence that has for the rest of their lives is as significant as starving. This might not seem intuitive to you, but there's plenty of literature out there that suggests it probably is true. That's at least the premise you have to prove in order to make scale important in the round, at least more important than, well, not just important in the round. You can play with different analogies that may appeal to your intuitions more, or feel free to experiment with analysis of why you justify why agents or consequences are always as valuable as each other. That's one way, at least I regularly do it. If you have other ways, feel free to put them in the chat, not the chat, feel free to put them in the comments section. Hopefully we can all learn from each other. What about intensity? So remember, intensity is that a description of why, a weighing metric that an impact is affecting somebody greater, even if it's affecting the same actor or the same number of actors. So here you have to justify why actually some consequences or some agents are either more or less affected by something. Here there are two things you want to do. First, you're going to have to be very clear, very precise, and very honest about what the threshold looks like for experience. As in, your burden is to prove that the impact you're talking about passes not just a threshold of significance over other impacts, but a meaningful threshold. Think about this thing I said earlier, right? Sometimes it can be very unclear why one additional negative experience can tip someone over the edge to make them even worse in their life. Like if an individual is in a bad state of existence, they're depressed, whatever, it's unclear why one more hurtful comment or one more rejection actually makes that much of a negative experience in their life. What you have to do when you do intensity weighing is to explain why actually that does make a difference. As in, it might not just be, your impact might not be this person gets insulted one more time. Your impact might be something that you argue is major for this person's life and meaningfully passes a threshold. For example, I don't know if this house was passed. Well, let's just keep the same example. So if an opening government on this house would ban drugs, you're trying to prove that drugs are uniquely harmful. And opening opposition are like, we shouldn't ban drugs because the people that are equally as affected by drugs would be more economically deprived if they lost the mechanisms of distribution of drugs and being able to sell them for their own time, right? i.e. being a drug dealer is good because you get money for it. Here you can argue that the actor is the same, but on opening government you'd have to justify why the dependency or addiction of drugs is worse than being slightly poorer. Other than using rebuttal to try to mitigate the margins of the impact, like you might find it intuitive firstly to say, well, you don't actually gain that much money, but let's take both teams at their best, which is what you should do when the power of weighing is such. Let's say they are both really bad impacts. All you have to explain is why being addicted or dependent to drugs, or having someone die of an overdose, or you're yourself dying of an overdose from a drug, is not just bad, but is meaningfully worse than being economically deprived slightly as a result of the other version of the impact of opposition. You can see quite intuitively why me just saying that is in itself quite persuasive, right? Often teams in debates like this, or any kind of debate, even if it's on a high level of abstraction, will just miss what I think is the most important and probably most enjoyable aspect of debating, which is making this more complex justification for why some things, even if they're true, matter less than other things. So that's an example of what you have to do, and maybe some exemplification of how you do it. The second thing, and this is a thing that's often missed, is you want to do an extra layer of analysis here if you're going to weigh intensities of impacts. What you have to prove is you ought to value the idea of utilitarianism in and of itself. So teams, especially in the current meta of debating as I speak, are quite lazy in the ways in which they conceptualize consequentialism. They presume that just because an impact is consequentialist, it is in of itself a more important impact than anything that is non-consequentialist. If you're going to try to justify why intensity should be the metric in the debate, you're going to have to explain why utilitarianism as a framework is something that is actually legitimate and should be valued as true in the debate. I am not saying by saying this that you will always lose a debate if you weigh on intensity if you don't prove B, because most teams will not challenge the premise of B. But if you're in strong rooms, and maybe now if people watch this they will do it more, will challenge you if you do not prove that metric of utilitarianism when you do intensity weighing. You need to do it. But I think if you do A, in 99% of instances, it probably will be sufficient, because A is probably a much harder thing to do. The way you prove that utilitarianism is something that is morally legitimate or morally more legitimate than non-utilitarianism is go and look at the principle video that Alistair made. They will tell you. Cool. Let's look at the way you do vulnerability. So by vulnerability is that some actors traditionally in debating you'll often hear things like minority actors, sexual or racial minorities, or disproportionately poorer people, or the developing world's people, etc. How can you convince the judges that they matter more than other actors in the debate? Here, it's actually just the flip of the scale argument, right? Rather than all consequences or agents mattering, your burden with this piece of weighing is to explain why all actors are not actually as valuable as other actors, i.e. there are some actors that are uniquely maybe more open to the impact, or more uniquely affected by an impact. So the burden here could be framed as the uniqueness of impact, as in there are some actors that are affected by X rather than other actors, but probably in the more grand scale of vulnerability weighing is that these actors are affected to a greater level than other actors. You can see how within vulnerability it is in itself a form of meta weighing, because vulnerability weighing does depend upon intensity weighing, right? The second thing I said was that some actors are affected more than other actors. This suggests that you have to prove the things about intensity, right? Explain why these actors are actually experiencing more intensely. But the uniqueness of vulnerability is the first point I mentioned, i.e. why there are some people who are affected, but those people that are affected should matter in the debate. So vulnerability is actually quite a principled justification as a piece of weighing. It is a justification for why, even if all actors are affected, some actors matter more than other actors. You can either justify this by explaining that the effect to some actors is worse, as in often it can conceptualize like things like economic disparity, that whilst if I robbed £100 from everybody, that is bad, it is far worse when I rob the £100 from the person that has only £50 in their account, because the impact that results in their life is worse. I conceptualize this in debating as they do not have a inbuilt self-defense mechanism against the consequence, i.e. they are poor already, the scale of harm becomes much worse, the meta scale of harm becomes much worse when you deprive them of their resources. Here, with this argumentation, the idea that you're grasping at is the fact that impacts, and especially in terms of experience and consequentialism, aren't linear. As in, one more additional unit of happiness doesn't actually necessarily make a person 1 unit more happy. In fact, you're trying to persuade, probably through intuitions and analogies, why it's more sigmoidal as a relationship, why individuals who are very happy don't gain that much from an extra level of happiness, but individuals who are really despondent and don't have any happiness, then extra bit of the same unit of happiness causes more of a change in their life than others. Think about this also in terms of suffering, that individuals who are in a uniquely disprivileged state with no defense mechanisms may feel a bad impact worse than other people who have more self-defense mechanisms. Gave the idea of economics earlier, could be the idea of things like tyranny of power, stuff like that. Maybe recourse to change the action or prevent the action from occurring to them, etc. So that's the burden for vulnerability. Let's lastly look at longevity. So longevity here just means, obviously, the persistence of that impact. So here, once again, you are accepting the scale premise, which is that all actors are as valuable as each other. However, even if this is true, some actors are affected longer than other actors. The way in this, I think longevity is the most intuitive weighing, and it's actually the weighing it is not utilized enough as I think it should be, at least not explicitly. It's just to justify why, for some people, impacts are more persistent in their lives, i.e. robbing everyone of £100 will affect a poor person more because the persistence of them being poor is more exaggerated, because potentially they're poor because they have very few income streams, such that the £100 deprivation will ruin their lives for longer than stealing £100 from a very rich person who may have an impact that is just they feel a bit annoyed for 7 seconds and then they earn another £100 and their aggrievement is significantly lower. That's a more flippant example, but hopefully that illustrates what longevity is, i.e. just proving that maybe all actors are valuable, which makes longevity a very good form of weighing against scale, because it means you minimize the amount of effort you have to do because you're agreeing with a lot of the work the scale weighers have done for you previously. You're just quibbling over how much they are affected, as in they are affected maybe to the same but not as long as each other. The inherent piece of logic within this claim is that there is something important about temporalness. Either this is just because of the utilitarian premise, that utility, i.e. experience, i.e. positive negativeness, desirability, undesirability, is it additive, as in it adds up over time? As in, if I have 3 days of happiness, this is equivalent to having 1 day of happiness, 3 days worth of happiness in 1 day, as in you have the properties of transitivity and combinations from mathematics. But this is just I think what I'm getting too in depth with this now. If this doesn't make any sense to you, then I'm sorry, debating is going to really annoy you. So longevity, therefore, is another type of weighing metric you can use, and this is the burden you have to implement it. So this is how we're going to implement impact weighing. How do we implement analytical weighing? So analytical weighing is something that is, as far as I can tell, something that is very lacking in today's debating, but it's also something that judges are more requiring of rather than impact weighing. As in, if you're an extension speaker, oftentimes the debate calls for you to do extra layers of analysis, but judges, oftentimes because they don't want to be accused of being insertionary, or they just aren't fucking thinking, will want you to give them the explanation for why the things that you have just proven are actually things that ought to be proven, even if they can think of those reasons themselves. There are a set of judges who aren't like this. I think Irish judges, for example, are judges that are very lenient on the necessity of analytical weighing, but it is a good practice and skill to develop, even if especially if you're just new to debating. I think this is where also, as I said earlier, it makes debating slightly more interesting when you have to think about, both in prep and dynamically as the debate is going on, why actually are the reasons I'm giving more persuasive than the reasons that have already been happening in the debate. I think this is a more fun and intellectually rigorous aspect of debating. So recognize that BP is just fundamentally a game about analysis and logical certainty at its heart, or what it aims to be at least. So your goal is just to persuade by analysis that that you are more persuasive than other teams in the debate. So let's see how you do this. So we know that certainty weighing just means explaining that what you have proven is your analysis makes an impact more likely to actually materialize in the world. How do you actually go about weighing a claim on certainty? Here's what you just have to do. You have to say that the mecs you've provided, i.e. the justifications for why the world changes or the impact accrues, are actually just either more true or more certain than specifically others that exist in the debate. Here, this becomes very specific to the type of analysis you're weighing against. So I can't give you a general reason for why one piece of analysis works better than others. This very much depends upon the two pieces of analysis you're weighing against each other. The only advice I can give you is, if you're weighing on certainty, do not just say, we weigh on certainty, and then you sit down. This might help some judges. Some judges might be like, oh, that's enough. But realistically, it's not actually enough in the objective sense. What you need to do is explain why we gave you reason X. Other team, as probably your opening, gave you reason Y. Why actually is reason Y not as persuasive as reason X? So let's think of an example. So let's just go banning drugs again. If opening government had said, let's presume they proved efficacy, so banning drugs actually causes a change in the world, so we can't weigh on priority, as in analytical priority. Instead, they just and you're both trying to argue that banning drugs is good because it means fewer people get access to drugs, and therefore they get less addicted. Opening government might have argued, the reason this is good is because drugs, by their very nature, are very addictive. Once you take them, you can't stop taking them, and this deprives you of your liberty, and this is a bad thing. Seems fairly intuitive. Let's say the analysis that your extension speaker delivered was something along the lines of this, whereby they say, drugs, whilst they may be intrinsically bad, may affect some people worse than others. However, drug dealers know this. What they want to do is they want to cut drugs, as in mix compounds together, such to maximize the addictiveness of drugs, such that you uniquely have to come to them for your fix opposed to others, because if you go to other drug dealers, they won't give the drugs they give you will not be the same compounds, and therefore the dependency relationship your brain has formed to certain types of chemicals, specifically the chemicals that the first drug dealer gave you, aren't recapitulated by drug dealer 2, which is why you'll always return to drug dealer 1. This explains why drugs will be bad. what you can do with a piece, this plausibly is more certain impacting. What you do here is to explain, yes, opening government and us in closing government are both trying to persuade to you that drugs are bad. What my extension speaker has explained is a more certain way, a certain route to why drugs will actually be bad. Because it is true that some people may naturally have a better tolerance to natural compounds than others, but we've given you the incentive and capacity reasons for why drugs will likely be engineered to be uniquely pernicious to people. This proves on a greater level of certainty that actually drugs will be bad, and therefore you should weigh this as more important than opening government's route to the impact, as in you're more certain that drugs are actually bad per closing government's analysis. This, plausibly, could be one way in which you weigh uncertainty. Here is just specifically you compare the mechanisms that were given, as in the reasons why an argument is true. This is something that is hard to do, especially in debates that are not as simple as this House would ban drugs, and especially in debates where teams don't just give one reason but may give 10. You have to consider more broadly how certain things are more persuasive than others, which makes it this type of weighing hard, but definitely a very rewarding mechanism of debate, a mechanism of weighing. Something that is definitely important in earlier rounds when the teams are more likely to be random, but can be the thing that it matters if you're going to make an analytical extension in the first place. Practice matters, and I think this is doing that kind of thing, analytical weighing that I just talked about, at least I find the most intellectually stimulating and therefore the most rewarding aspect of debating. Priority. Priority is actually quite key. So, sorry, not key, quite intuitive, which is just to say, okay, other teams have proven one condition to get to an argument, as in this House with ban drugs, have proven drugs are bad, but they haven't actually proven banning drugs would prevent drugs from being distributed in the first place. We are going to do that. The weighing here is your burden is just to explain why the thing that you claim is important to getting to the impact is true. Here, you probably the best and most persuasive way of doing this is just to explain what it means to not have this thing satisfied. So in the case that I've just given, it would be like you literally do not know from opening government whether or not the number of drugs distributed is different, whether or not actually people do get their hands on more or fewer drugs, which means even if drugs are bad, they don't actually prove they're reducing drugs in the first place. You need analysis to why that actually happens in order for you to get to their impacts. Therefore, it is necessary to have this analysis, and therefore it is necessary for you to put us above opening government. That's the way you do priority. Obviously, debates can be more complicated. You can think about a useful way of in more complex debates. Priority analysis can usually be on two lines, i.e., incentives and capacity. All argumentation, particularly when it's arguing how people's behavior changes or how the world changes, depends on one, the incentives for change, but also secondly, a capacity to actually change. You can claim, if teams have not done this, as in your opening hasn't done this, as in they've just explained why incentive shifts but not capacity, or why capacity shifts are not incentives, you can use priority analytical weighing to argue why, even if individuals had the capacity to change, opening government hadn't given you the incentives for why they would actually change in the first place, vice versa. So that's probably what happens in more complex debates, but this is very case specific. Try it out. Think about drills, think about examples. We've got some later, and we'll see if, this is at least another form of analytical weighing. Last is robustness, which is just claiming that the reasons you've given or the impacts you've provided require a stronger challenge and are thus therefore more persuasive. Here, like priority, it's just illustration to the judges, as in opening government's argument X was quite either got destroyed by a response that this team gave them, or would have been destroyed by this response. This response is quite obvious. However, our analysis is insulated against this response, but more importantly, it would require either engagement on multiple levels of reasoning rather than a single level of reasoning, but also just giving reasons why it's unintuitive, i.e. preemptively destroying the responses that come to you. This is a very involved piece of weighing, as in to a large extent, robustness weighing, particularly in closing, either massively depends upon your opening team having been destroyed, which doesn't always universally happen, or in its best sense, requires you to actually rebut your opening, which is a rule that isn't allowed in debating. However, even if that be a rule, It is not actually a rule to point out rebuttal could have happened to the round. So you might want to play it by ear and just test whether or not a judge actually likes this, which is often the way you determine what judges are willing or not willing to take, because different judges will do different things and think differently about the rules. I personally think that pointing out there are holes in your opening, pointing out that some responses are more damaging to them than you, is a legitimate strategy of victory because it's an illustration of why your argumentation is more persuasive than theirs. That is how you would do it, but bear in mind that some judges may not like that. Either you want to play the game and just ignore those judges, or hopefully you're just in BP for the enjoyment of it, and you're just willing to do this because it's an interesting and fun thing to do. Who doesn't like to rebut your opening, especially when they're not expecting you to do it? So those are the 3 ways you can implement analytical weighing. Recognize that you need to get good analytical weighing because this is essential for opening in shallow motions and closing. What? That doesn't make any sense. What I mean by that is it's essential when you have a shallow motion, which means, oh no, I know what I mean now. So motions that are shallow, i.e. they don't have a lot of material out there, as in there's probably 1 or 2 impacts that can happen in a debate. Have a look at the motion debriefs as an example, because there are some examples of more shallow motions than others. In opening, you want to have at least some reasoning to either, especially in deputy, why what you're proving, you have sufficiently proven it. So there's nothing more that can be added to your analysis in opening that would persuade could persuade the judges to rank other teams above you. And similarly in closing, when you have a shallow motion, which means you're usually lending on analytical extensions rather than impact, i.e. horizontal extensions, analytical weighing is essential, right? Because you have to justify whether the analysis you've provided was more persuasive than analysis that likely exists, and likely exists to a strong extent in other teams. Therefore, getting good at these 3 examples of ways of weighing is crucial if you want to do well in debating in general. Cool. Your turn. So let's say you have 2 teams. The first team argues that immigrants, it doesn't matter what the motion is, argues that immigrants receive backlash because of right-wing reactions to whatever the policy is in the motion. Team B, on the other hand, argues that this policy keeps prices and wages steady for the population because of its restraint on investor speculation. So who knows what this policy is, but these are the impacts that exist, the impact that exists from A and B team. How could you weigh Team A against Team B, and how could you weigh Team B against Team A? So have a think. So let's think about impact weighing. So we have 4 types of impact weighing. We have scale, i.e. we affect more people than others. We have vulnerability. We affect a uniquely vulnerable actor that either is affected to a greater degree or should be principally valued over other types of larger numbers of actors. Longevity of impact, and also intensity of impact. Let's think of how we can use those 4 weighing metrics for immigrants in terms of Group A, Team A. So immigrants may not access scale over Team B, right? Team B is affecting presumably the entire population, whereas immigrants are a subpart of that population. So scale is probably the weighing Team B will try to implement against Team A. However, Team A might try to use things like longevity of impact. Oh no, maybe not actually. Team B probably also uses longevity as well, right? Things like if you do not have steady prices of wages, this may affect you for a larger amount of time because there's more fluctuations than whatever the backlash is from Team A. Team A could actually characterize backlash to be something that is persistent, something that has cycles of anger, cycles of retribution. So you could access longevity weighing at A. You can access intensity weighing at A, as in it's unclear how much wages literally affect you that much, whereas the backlash these immigrants could be experiencing could be a fundamental threat on their own safety, make them feel as if they're not welcome in the community, which means they can actively dissociate from a community, which might be more fundamentally harmful to their way in which they can operate in the world, i.e. accessing resources in the first place. Team B, on the other hand, can try to weigh on scale. They could also try to weigh on longevity of impact, how economics persistently affects people more, because often if things are unsteady, especially for poorer people, i.e. accessing therefore a form of vulnerability, people may get into debt, which cycles into cycles of debt in the first place, in the second place, should I say, which means there may be persistence of impact for Team B. Maybe they don't affect, they may also affect vulnerability as well, actually. They might try to argue that actually the prices and wages do affect everybody, but they affect some people more than others, particularly poor individuals. And maybe the very immigrants Team A talk about that are likely, and they could provide reasons for this, likely to be more dispossessed, isolated into ring-fenced communities with low amounts of social welfare or social support, etc. So that's some ways you could do impact weighing. So what about analytical weighing? So the 3 P's of analytical are certainty, robustness, and priority. So have a think about how we could weigh how you could analytically weigh these teams against each other. So in terms of certainty, I mean, it's very hard insofar as there's not that much analysis given in this slide, but on surface level, Team B has at least provided a reason to why prices are kept steady, as in something to do with investor speculation. So Team B could say, we've at least given you a reason why the impact actually accrues. Team A haven't. They've just claimed that this thing becomes, the people react in a certain way. There are more stages in that analysis that are unsatisfied than ours. Therefore, we should win uncertainty. Plausible. Team B could try to weigh uncertainty by weighing on intuitiveness. So Team A might argue, yes, maybe we don't have as many we don't have as many steps of analysis as Team B, but that's why our argument is more persuasive to you, because it's quite intuitive to why this policy will engineer right wings to be angry and they are likely of everything to take it out on immigrants. Whereas it's really unclear how much investor speculation actually has that much bearing on things like prices and wages. Not the type of weighing you would like to do, as in the rules now allow whips to add new layers of mechanization, so you should never now be in a position, even as whip, to not be able to analyze a claim that has literally no fucking analysis to it. But that's something you could have done here. On priority, you could have argued that in Team B, prices and wages is what produces the backlash, as in produces the incentive for backlash, because they want to scapegoat individuals because their life is worse, or to try to justify this policy in the first place because economics is affecting more people, which means they become more alert to why this policy might not be a good thing. So Team B might claim priority of impact over Team A, as in the only reason immigrants would receive backlash is because of the B thing happening. We prevent B thing happening, which is why most backlash doesn't happen. Similarly, in the inverse, Team A could argue immigrants receiving backlash may cause things like crime to rise in a certain area, may cause social media signaling of people being angry and rioting, which changes the way investor behavior operates to a mass scale. So you could argue that A is prior to B. In terms of robustness, similar to the first thing I mentioned. So Team A could argue they're more robust against challenges because it's far more intuitive that because the burden is lower, as in you have less things to prove to why right-wing reaction would not look at immigrants as scapegoats, whereas Team B has a lot more jumps of analysis and therefore is more likely to be challenged responsively. You could also just claim why you could frame that Team B is likely to be mitigated at some point by frames about the fact that speculators won't be as hard in speculating, and that maybe it's just hard to actually predict what happens in economics in this situation. So the robustness of the claim is lower than your claim. Similarly, Team B could just argue, well, we've given you at least one reason why X accrues, as in why prices are kept steady. They've just literally claimed something. So at least we have a reason to believe our claim, which is why it's more robust to challenges. So that's an example of how you can use each of the 7 weighing metrics for Team A against Team B, but also Team B against Team A. So alongside building up a weighing claim, let's look at how to undermine a weighing claim. So a part of weighing is not just to find what weighing metric you wish to use, and it is not just explaining why that weighing metric is important, but at the very high levels of debating, it is about explaining why other types of weighing metrics are not valuable in a debate, even when they're instantiated to be so. So let's look at how you do this for the impact weighings. So scale. Quite intuitive, it's just the inverse of the burden used to instantiate its importance. So if you're trying to weigh an impact on intensity, and another team has weighed an impact on scale, you can't win the debate. You're very unlikely to win a debate by just brute forcing the idea of why intensity matters, particularly if teams are prior to you, as in have come before you, and particularly if those teams are reppy. So how would you do that? You just have to prove why not all actors are equal, or all actors are not as numerous as each other, or there's a massive degree of uncertainty about whether or not how many people are affected in the first place. On the first, this is probably the premise of your intensity or longevity of intensity of vulnerability analysis, as in by proving that vulnerability and intensity matters, you should have disproven that not all actors are equally valuable. In terms of effects being numerous and the uncertainty of how scale is, this requires rebuttal, as in explaining why actually the team isn't affecting as many people as they think they are, and you have to demonstrate to the panel and to the judges in general that you have destroyed the certainty of the scale sufficiently enough. Like, it's probably not true that you can disprove that there isn't at least one more person affected, but oftentimes scale weighing might not be done in such granularity, as an opening government team might have not used what is a rather persuasive piece of scale weighing, which is that even if we affect only one more person, this is sufficient to win the debate because of the severity of that impact on all these people. Even if they have done that, you just have to justify why one more person isn't actually affected, or even if one more person is affected, and here's why you use meta-scale weighing, there is still a significant number of people who are at least affected to a more intense level than opening government talk about if you're trying to weigh against scale via intensity. Hopefully that makes sense. In terms of intensity, so if you're trying to undermine intensity weighing, obviously you have to instantiate that all actors are equal, which you should have done if you're weighing against intensity, but you also have to explain why all actors are affected to the same degree. Similarly, quite intuitive, trying to wash out the idea that intensity is a delta in the debate, as in is in a difference in the debate. Or once again, you claim uncertainty. So you use your rebuttal skills to explain why actually the panel shouldn't find it sufficiently persuasive that the team has convinced you that these impacts actually accrue more intensely on another person. Here you want to run the judges through what actually the impact is and provide some intuitive justifications for why it isn't as intense. As in, obviously there are some impacts which you can't do, as in like the impact of dying or the impact of being addicted to drugs. It's probably hard to mitigate how much of an effect that has a person versus an impact of like the person loses a pound. Like, I think you're losing that intensity clash. But oftentimes they're not as stark as that. Strategically speaking, if you're ever in that circumstance and you find that there has been a convincing piece of weighing by a team, either why intensity matters or why a specific impact matters, strategically speaking, it might be more useful to try to flip that impact. But if a video on strategy ever comes up, that's probably what we'll talk about. In terms of vulnerability, so intensity is just persuading the judges that if you want to undermine intensity, that all actors are equally as valuable, all actors are affected as intensely, washing it, or using rebuttal as uncertainty by saying it's unclear what the margin of intensity effects actually are in the debate. In terms of vulnerability, once again, just explain that all actors are actually equally as valuable, thus there isn't actually a more vulnerable actor, or even if there are more vulnerable actors, the non-vulnerable actors are actually affected more or affected worse than those that the team claim are vulnerable. Here, this is quite effective because many teams may just jump into the assumption that just because a person is a minority, or just because a person is in a developing world, or just because a person is in X scenario, that they must be affected more by impacts. It might be the claim that the impact is just poverty, but it doesn't matter where you are born. If you've proved the level of poverty deprivation is the same, then it should affect everybody equally, right? That's an example of it. Often teams are quite lazy with the use of vulnerability. It's something that I think schoolies are taught. I'm not going to junk on the schoolies, but I think this is where it comes from, where they say the word vulnerability and then they sit down, and that's not sufficient. So that's the things you have to do to undermine vulnerability weighing. In terms of longevity weighing, quite intuitive. Not all actors are equal, so that means that trying to prove that there are some actors that are more valuable than others. So even if a team has successfully weighed that this impacts a person for longer, all they have to prove is this may be true, but there are other actors that are affected worse, even if they're affected for lesser time, than the actor that is affected for a longer time, because their effect is less. Another useful piece of framing, and obviously this requires justification under this framing, but this is the start idea for you, is that even if an actor is affected for longer, the unique type of impact that is affecting them longer has massively diminished effects over time. As in, you could argue things like, like calling someone a bitch probably affects them quite extensively for the moment you call them a bitch, because of things like maybe you do it in a group and it makes you feel very embarrassing. But after 3 months, even though they still theoretically may have the memory of being called a bitch, the effect that probably has on that person is not as intense as it was when they first had it. Obviously, I don't think any team in the debate will be like, the effect of bitchiness lasts for the entire life. This is why it should win the debate. Proud to propose. Although if they did, it's quite intuitive how you get rid of that. But that's just an exemplification of how the idea that you have to prove in order to undermine that. Obviously, that might be case specific, but you know, you're smart. If you've got to an hour in this video, then I presume you actually know probably a lot anyway. So here are generally 4 strategies for undermining weighing, broadly independent of the type of weighing you're trying to undermine, going from weakest to strongest. So the weakest is just to assert the counter weighing, which is like a team goes, scale is most important because all actors are affected, end speech. You stand up and go, intensity matters most in the debate because all actors aren't actually equal. Some are affected more than others, and you sit down. That is the weakest form of trying to undermine a piece of weighing. Like, you have undermined it to a certain extent. You have provided a counter, or you have provided a counter claim to why that isn't true, but it's unlikely going to win the debate. Judges will just go, you had a responsive burden to challenge the piece of weighing that came before you. We default to what we heard first, which is probably a legitimate strategy if you're just literally doing that. So this is the start of the thing you have to do, but it's certainly not the end, and it's certainly not going to maximize your chance of winning a debate. The second is framing values of actors, i.e., which actors are actually valuable, and why are they valuable? It's probably the question of how you undermine unique pieces of weighing. So if you frame that all actors are as valuable as each other, you undermine intensity, vulnerability, and potential longevity. However, if you frame that certain actors in the debate are affected greater than others, even if the other ones are actually affected to a certain degree, you've undermined scale to a certain extent, and you've maximized intensity and vulnerability. So framing is the easiest thing to do because it should be built into your analysis anyway. And this is why a lot of teams do implicit weighing, even if some judges or some teams don't recognize it. This third thing, and this is where it becomes a bit more time consuming, but it starts to enter into the more territories of effectivity, is undermining plausibility. So you use rebuttal to undermine the reasons that other teams have given to why their weighing matters. It is very worth noting, and taking a step back for a second, the vast majority of teams will have not done the thing that I am now claiming that you have to undermine. Oftentimes, in rooms that are not the top room in a good competition, there will at least be one, if not two, if not all teams bar you, that haven't actually done what I've explained that you have to do in instantiation of weighing. Which means the point at which you instantiate your weighing, you have probably not just won the debate, but won it by a massive margin. You can, if you have extra time, point out to the judges why they should credit you even further, because you're now going to take the teams at their best and proved why, even if they had provided weighing, it's still weighing to counter yours, why it still wouldn't be persuasive to the judges, which is how, even if you're in a shit room, you can still probably get high speaks, which might be important for breaking, as it often is, ask Parth and I, for our Euros journey. And we didn't, so I guess I didn't take my own lesson, but that's why I'm doing the video now before the next Euros rather than as I should have done before the other Euros. So undermining plausibility. So just justifying why the other burdens of why if a team tried to argue scale, why scale actually isn't true. The most short but probably lethal way of doing this, other than doing the more rebuttal focused and quite time consuming method of undermining plausibility, stuff that should come in the responsive speakers, as in the second speaker and the whip speaker, is to demonstrate the counter weighing. So here is using things like analogies, intuitions, and exemplification to explain why the weighing shouldn't matter. So, for instance, if you're trying to undermine scale, is to try to use characterization, but through the lens of the thing you're trying to weigh. So if you're trying to weigh if you're trying to weigh intensity against scale, this would be demonstrating what intensity actually looks like to a judge, characterizing for it, and why actually not that many people are actually affected as much as the scale isn't. Not everyone experiences what you've just described, but the people who do experience it matter. I think that demonstration of counterweighing by exemplification, which can often be placed into analysis in first speeches, can be short, but can be very effectively lethal, especially if they're in a closing half, especially if they're in closing opposition and the government whip is weak. Obviously, you want to do all four of these things to varying levels, and strategically speaking, different circumstances will demand different levels of prioritization. In rooms that are analytically difficult, you probably want to focus on having a thing proven rather than focusing on not proving something and trying to weigh the shit out of something. All of this requires strategic observations which come from experience. Hopefully we'll have a video soon, because the more I talk about these videos and record them, the more I realize that strategy is actually something that's really useful for high-level debating, obviously. Cool. So how do we undermine, that's how you undermine impact weighing. So let's see how we undermine analytical weighing. So uncertainty, this is quite intuitive actually, and people do this all the time in debating. It's what most schoolies and everyone literally does, which is just to rebut. You want to actually prove why. Certainty is probably a metric that judges are already like, I'm going to weigh this debate on certainty if everything else fails. So if no team does impact weighing, what I'm going to think about is which claims are more persuasive to me. Here you can weigh uncertainty, so you can undermine certainty in the room by just showing that other teams haven't actually proven things as well as you have. So maybe they haven't provided as compelling incentive analysis. Maybe they've missed a burden, or just something rings untrue, or you've rebutted a thing such that the reasons they have provided thing X to be true are no longer true or should be granted to be true in the debate because of your rebuttal. See path rebuttal video on how to do that. It's quite good. How to undermine priority. This is where you preemptively show that you've satisfied your burdens. So this both in prep and also as a deputy speaker, you should be listening to your first speaker and actually honestly thinking as an extension speaker, is this thing actually proven? Have we missed something that we need to prove? Often it's hard to do in the moment, and everyone has had moments in debates, if you do it long enough, where you sit down as a DPM or DLO and you're like, this is probably fairly good, we're going to be well here. And then your member of government or member of opposition stands up and goes, opening government or opening opposition, didn't explain why actually this happened. You're like, oh fuck, yeah, we didn't explain that. All you want to do here is prioritize actual doing analytical rigidity. We have a video on analysis of how you do that. But also the weighing here is explaining in deputy about what needed to be proven and why you've actually proven it. So taking this can be as instrumental as just taking yourself through the roadmap of victory, as in motion causes X thing to happen. We prove that the motion causes X. X causes Y. We've proven how X causes Y. Y link and Y, and then whatever how many ever intermediary steps. Then Y gets to Z, which is the impact. We've proven this. We've proven it sufficiently. This type of weighing should be involved in the deputy speech to a certain extent, but it should be more heavily prioritized in instances where you fear analytical extensions are more viable, i.e. in shallow emotions or emotions where you know teams that are in the back half of you like to do analytical extensions, like me. So if I'm in your closing half, then maybe make my life more miserable than it already is, and tell the judges why nothing I can analytically say will beat you. Although to be fair, I do a very good job of not beating teams analytically anyway, so you might not need to do anything. Last is on robustness. Here, once again, nothing actually that fancy. It is just be preemptive. Don't allow teams to be able to claim that you're weak to responses or that you got destroyed by responses. Take cases at their best, both within prep, as in recognizing what your opposition will argue, and trying to develop analytical claims that are insulated against the truth of their statements. So in this house would ban drugs, you don't want to have a case like drugs be bad, and then just ignore the fact that there are actual opposition arguments, i.e. people should have the agency to consume drugs that they want, that people get economic empowerment, that they're good for tourism or whatever the fuck. Here you want to be like, all these things, especially in opening government, all of these things could be true. Here's reasons why they're not true. Here are reasons why the opposition think we're not true, aren't true. And here's why we prove that it actually results in them. Just be robust in your analysis. This requires prepping quite effectively with your partner. A way to get better at this, if you find that you're often being responded to and destroyed, and often being extended on in this way, as in being better at responsive, by closing teams being better than you at responsive challenges, is to prep speeches on your own, even if you're not a PM speaker, record them, listen to them, scrutinize them, see what didn't go right, do them again. This is obviously slightly an introduction to the debating video, but like all of my fucking videos are not that introductory. This is a drill that you may wish to use. Cool. So there's literally no way of avoiding the rules of the game, right? You're never going to be able to convince a judge, actually, chair, you shouldn't give a fuck about what is more certain in this debate. Or you shouldn't give a damn about priority of logic. Like, fuck logic. It doesn't work in the real world. That's not going to work. Or trying to say, just ignore rebuttal. It's cringe. That's not going to win the debate. It's not going to change the meta of debating. So there's no way to actually undermine why judges think certainty, think priority, or think a robustness are important. All you have to do is undermine the viability of these weighing strategies against you, which is how you undermine analytical weighing against you, is by making sure it isn't legitimate to be used against you in the first place. Cool. So here's another example. In terms of, now we just have the same arguments we had earlier, as in what Team A are arguing about immigrants receiving backlash from right-wing reaction to the policy versus Team B's argumentation about this policy keeping prices stable because of investor speculation, restraint of investor speculation. Now we have the weighing the teams actually gave. In Team A, they try to explain that immigrants are uniquely vulnerable due to their low economic and political capital, and that's why they should be valued as most in the debate. Whereas Team B argued that everybody is equally affected by economic downturns, as everybody habituates their lifestyle before they lose their disposable income and have to undergo austerity, which produces the same level of stress and anxiety in these people, which is why scale should matter. So we have now the weighing. How could we demonstrate counterweighing? So how could Team A undermine Team B's weighing, and how could Team B undermine Team A's weighing? So have a think about that. So let's think about how we undermine scale. So Team A could try to undermine the scale of Team B by, one, trying to rebut the idea that the habituation idea is not true. As in, whilst people do habituate to a certain extent, there is a massive difference between no longer being able to have 3 Starbucks a week. Now you only get to have 2 Starbucks a week versus now you have to tell poor Jimmy he's not eating today. Both of these are same difference, but it's just arguing the sigmoidal relationship, as in the equal deprivation to one person matters more than the same deprivation to another person because of this exact weighing you've actually provided in Team A, which is that some people are more vulnerable. Here, you can use your weighing to you could use counterweighing to undermine the validity of that weighing within that argument, as in the weighing doesn't actually link to the argumentation of economics, as I just did. Or you could use the meta counterweighing, which is to say that no, these people are not uniquely affected, because what economics does, even if people are in a certain extent uniquely affected, like even if everyone is affected to the same degree about economics, people aren't affected to the same degree about backlash because, one, not everyone receives the type of backlash we talk about. 2, the persistence of this backlash is far worse. Or 3, even if individuals are like habituate to the same levels of anxiety actually doesn't work like that. It can accrue and become existential over time that surpasses the threshold of being really bad once it happens over and over again. There's a difference between being a bit anxious because your 401k is not as big as it was before, or in a less flippant way, you're a little bit more scared about how you're going to get food. However, if you literally cannot walk down the street anymore because you think you're going to get beat up, the fact you stay awake at night because your windows keep getting smashed in, or you literally don't want to leave your kids alone because you think they're going to be racially abused, that has a more long-bearing attack on you than anything economics could have, and only affects individuals that actually are the ones that Team A talk about. So that's an exemplification of demonstrating counterweighing, but also using ideas of kind of flippancy and rebuttal to why maybe equality's effects could actually be true for economics, but certainly aren't true for what Team A are talking about. What about the counterweighing then? So Team B could argue against the vulnerability that, as I already argued earlier, that everyone is affected, including immigrants. However, the economics that affects immigrants is far worse than the backlash immigrants receive. So here you could instrumentalize responsive challenges to try to mitigate what backlash actually looks like. Like, you probably don't want to allow a team to persuade a judge of what I just said, i.e. the most severe form of backlash is what most people would experience as immigrants. could be like, maybe there are 2 people that experience the kind of thing that William just said, but the vast majority, the type of backlash they see is they are pillars of their community and they just all rally around in a mechanism of self-defense when the Daily Mail calls them a racial slur, or someone on the Daily Mail comment section calls them a racial slur, which most people don't recognize, and they're already habituated to that anyway because they have to experience this as much. What this concedes is that maybe some people are affected more by others, but the impact of that effect is actually quite marginal to the people, as in very few people actually are affected in the way they talk about. And therefore you access the weighing about scale, because then you should prioritize how most people are affected rather than the few minority of individuals. You can see how that kind of rebuttal is effective to mitigate scale when trying to weigh with scale. So obviously in the Platonic sense, just proving n+1 is affected by team B should win the debate, but sometimes it just adds to the persuasiveness by making sure that the team that you're weighing against that isn't using scale accesses such a small level of scale, as in marginalizing as much as you can how many people are affected. The nuance here is you don't want to rebut the existence of this thing. It's actually far more persuasive to argue that yes, some immigrants would be affected, but the number that is affected in a way that the panel should uniquely care about, as in the ones I just characterized about being scared to walk through the streets, are so diminishingly few in number that whilst they probably are important, they aren't more important than all of the experiences of the n plus 99% people, and that doesn't work. The 99% of other people that aren't affected are affected by different things, and we shouldn't trade off 99% of people for a very small number of people that are affected very severely. So that's how you could demonstrate counterweighing. There are the other ways you could do this, both in certainty, but this video is already quite long, and I want to go to bed, so that's the last you get here for me for this video. Cool. So in summary, weighing is far more than headlines, and the success of weighing comes from succeeding, should I say now, not just trying, you should be able to succeed in this now, instantiating a weighing metric, but also undermining other people's weighing metric. Things like scale, intensity, vulnerability, and longevity are 4 ways you can weigh impacts. Certainty, priority, and robustness are 3 ways you can weigh analytical claims. Recognize that case generation, when you're building a case around a first speaker, ought to include this form of justified weighing, because this is a way not only just you conceptualize whether an impact is worth running, but also one in which you give your other speakers more things to respond to, and this goes on the area of strategy, but it can be quite strategic to include weighing early on, just so you know how the responses are, who's going to give you the responses and how they land in the room. Recognize that responsive speakers ought to be the ones that undermine challenges and demonstrate counter weighing to secure victories, and especially in tougher rooms. So the deputies and the whips are those that should prioritize engaging with the weighing that is in the round, explaining why either if your arguments are on the same clash, as in you're arguing yes, scale does matter, we just affect more people, then use rebuttal skills to show why the scale is bigger on your side than theirs. But in examples where the scale metric is different, as in one team argues scale is important, the other team is arguing robustness is important for some reason, arguing why scale matters more than the robustness of challenges is what the deputy speaker should do, i.e. arguing that robustness is the same across all speakers, but scale is only the thing that is changing. That's weighing. So hopefully this was useful to all skill levels. So hopefully if you didn't know what weighing was, you're now at least more familiar with it. If you knew what weighing was, you hopefully knew how to do it a bit better. And if you knew what weighing was, hopefully I gave you a different way of conceptualizing how you can actually go about formulaically winning in any type of clash in terms of the different types of weighing. Cool. Hopefully that was useful. If you got any thoughts or feedback, feel free to put them in the comments. Get that engagement going, boys. Yeah, see you around.